The morning of what should have been the happiest day of my life, I stood in my grandmother's vintage lace wedding dress, hands trembling as I applied the final touches of lipstick. In 3 hours, I would marry Jake, my college sweetheart of 6 years. My monthly salary of $9,600 as a senior software developer had finally allowed us to afford our dream wedding. But as I walked down that aisle, I had no idea that my future mother-in-law, Patricia, was about to destroy everything with one devastating demand. Growing up in Columbus, Ohio, with a single mother who worked double shifts at the diner and cleaned offices on weekends, I learned early that financial security meant everything. Mom sacrificed her social life, her hobbies, even her health to keep food on our table and a roof over our heads. Watching her struggle taught me that I never wanted to depend on anyone else for my survival. When I met Jake at Ohio State University during our sophomore computer science class, we bonded over shared struggles. He was there on partial scholarship working nights at a campus bookstore to cover expenses his teacher parents couldn't afford. We studied together in the library until closing time survived on ramen noodles and free pizza from campus events, and dreamed about the day we'd have stable careers and comfortable lives. After graduation, while Jake followed his passion into middle school education, earning $42,000 annually, I threw myself into the tech world. Starting as a junior developer at a growing startup, I worked 70-hour weeks, learned new programming languages on my own time, and gradually climbed the corporate ladder. 3 promotions in 4 years brought me to my current position as senior software developer with that coveted $9,600 monthly salary. Jake never showed jealousy about my income. When I suggested we split expenses proportionally based on our earnings, he gratefully agreed. When I offered to cover our vacation to Colorado or pay for his graduate school courses, he thanked me with genuine appreciation. I thought we had built the perfect partnership based on mutual support and shared goals. Patricia seemed like the ideal future mother-in-law throughout our 6-year relationship. She called me the daughter she never had, praised my career achievements, and insisted I was exactly what Jake needed. During holiday dinners at her suburban Cincinnati home, she would brag to neighbors about my success and tell them how proud she was to have such an accomplished daughter-in-law joining the family. Our wedding planning went smoothly, though I ended up covering most expenses since my income allowed us to afford the venue we both loved. The historic mansion overlooking the Ohio River cost $8,000 for the day, but seeing Jake's face light up when we toured it made every penny worthwhile. I handled the photographer, florist, and catering, while Patricia helped with small details like favors and decorations. The morning of September 15th arrived crisp and clear, with golden leaves beginning their autumn transformation outside my hotel window. My bridesmaids bustled around the suite, ensuring every detail was perfect. My mother sat quietly in the corner, tears of joy glistening as she watched me transform into a bride. She had never remarried after my father left when I was 8, dedicating her life entirely to raising me. "You look absolutely radiant, sweetheart," she whispered, adjusting my grandmother's pearl necklace around my neck. "Your grandmother would be so proud to see you wearing her dress and living the life she always dreamed of for our family." The ceremony at St. Mary's Chapel proceeded flawlessly. Jake's eyes filled with tears as I walked down the aisle, and his voice shook with emotion during our vows. We promised to support each other's dreams, share life's burdens equally, and never let outside influences damage our bond. Patricia dabbed her eyes with tissues throughout the service, appearing genuinely moved by our commitment. 200 guests gathered at the reception venue, filling the elegant ballroom with laughter and celebration. The dinner service went perfectly, and I felt overwhelmed with gratitude as friends and family toasted our future together. Jake's teaching colleagues shared funny stories about his dedication to his students, while my work friends joked about my legendary coding skills and weekend project marathons. Then Patricia stood up. She had waited until the formal toasts concluded, and most guests were relaxing with their wine and dessert. The room's attention naturally turned to her as she tapped her champagne flute with a silver spoon, the crystal ring echoing through the sudden quiet. "If I may have everyone's attention," she began, her smile bright but somehow different from earlier. "I have something important to share with my new daughter-in-law and all of you who love this young couple." My stomach fluttered with anticipation, expecting perhaps a sentimental speech about gaining a daughter or welcoming me into their family traditions. Jake squeezed my hand under the table, both of us wondering what surprise Patricia had planned. "Misty, darling," Patricia continued, her voice carrying clearly across the silent room. "You've had a successful career and we're all very proud of your achievements. But now that you're married to my son, it's time to prioritize what really matters. From today forward, you'll hand over your entire $9,600 salary and every bonus to me for proper family financial management." The words hit me like ice water. Around the room, guests shifted uncomfortably in their chairs, confused murmurs rippling through the crowd. My mother's face went pale across the room, her hand flying to her throat in shock. Patricia's smile never wavered as she delivered the crushing blow. "If you refuse this reasonable request, then walk out of this wedding right now. We don't need someone so selfish and career-obsessed in our family. A good wife supports her husband by contributing everything to the household, not pursuing personal ambition." The room fell into stunned silence. 200 people stared at me, waiting for my response to this unprecedented public ultimatum. My hands trembled as the full weight of Patricia's calculated cruelty sank in. She had planned this moment perfectly, using our wedding day and the pressure of public scrutiny to force my compliance. This wasn't about traditional family values or financial responsibility. This was about control, manipulation, and greed disguised as motherly concern. Patricia had waited until the most vulnerable moment of my life to reveal her true intentions, gambling that social pressure and my love for Jake would force me to submit to her outrageous demands. The sweet, supportive future mother-in-law I thought I knew was completely fake. The woman standing before our wedding guests with that cold smile was a stranger who had been planning this humiliation for months, possibly years. She had played the long game perfectly, earning my trust only to destroy me at the moment when resistance would be most difficult and painful. My heart pounded as I turned desperately toward Jake, searching his face for the support and protection I expected from my new husband. Surely he would stand up to his mother's outrageous demand, defend our partnership, and make it clear that our marriage was based on mutual respect rather than financial domination. Instead, Jake avoided my eyes completely. He stared down at his untouched wedding cake jaw clenched tight, shifting uncomfortably in his chair, but saying absolutely nothing. The silence stretched between us like a chasm, and with each passing second, I understood more clearly that this public humiliation had not caught him off guard. "Jake," I whispered urgently, leaning closer to him. "Say something. Tell her this is crazy." He finally looked at me, but instead of the righteous anger I expected, I saw resignation and guilt written across his features. "Misty," he said quietly, his voice barely audible above the uncomfortable murmur of guests. "Maybe you should consider what she's saying. It might be easier if we all just try to keep the peace here." Those words shattered something fundamental inside me. This man I had loved for 6 years, whom I had supported through graduate school and celebrated with during every career Milestone was suggesting I surrender my financial independence to avoid conflict with his mother. He wasn't shocked by Patricia's demand because he had known it was coming. Patricia sensed my hesitation and pressed her advantage, her voice growing stronger and more commanding. You see, everyone, this is exactly the kind of selfish thinking that destroys modern marriages. Young women today are so focused on their careers that they forget their primary duty is to their family. A truly loving wife would be grateful for guidance in managing finances properly. I glanced around the room, seeing expressions ranging from shock to confusion to barely concealed anger. My mother had tears streaming down her face, clearly desperate to intervene, but uncertain how to navigate this unprecedented situation. My college roommate Sarah looked ready to march over and physically confront Patricia, while several of Jake's teaching colleagues appeared mortified by the spectacle. But Jake remained silent. Memories suddenly flooded my mind with painful clarity. I remembered countless small moments over the past year when Patricia had made subtle comments about my career focus. She would joke about me being a workaholic or suggest that successful women often struggled to be good wives. I had laughed off these remarks, attributing them to generational differences rather than recognizing them as calculated preparation for this moment. I also remembered how Jake had never once defended me during those conversations. When Patricia implied that my weekend coding projects showed misplaced priorities, Jake had nodded along. When she suggested that wives who earned more than their husbands created unnatural relationship dynamics, Jake had remained diplomatically quiet. I had interpreted his silence as peacekeeping, but now I understood it was complicity. Jake, I said more loudly, my voice carrying across the silent ballroom. This is our wedding day. This is supposed to be about our commitment to each other. Are you really going to let your mother demand control over my salary and career? He looked up at me with something that might have been regret, but his words crushed any remaining hope. Misty, you know how much family means to me. Can't we find some kind of compromise here? Maybe there's a way to make everyone happy. Everyone happy. As if my complete financial subjugation to his mother was just a minor detail to be negotiated. As if the career I had built through years of hard work and sacrifice was some disposable hobby rather than my livelihood and identity. Patricia smiled triumphantly, sensing victory. You see how reasonable my son is. He understands that family harmony requires sacrifice from everyone. Now, Misty, what will it be? Will you join this family properly, or will you walk away from everything you claim to love? The manipulative brilliance of her strategy became crystal clear. She had orchestrated this confrontation specifically for our wedding day, surrounded by witnesses, knowing that most people would be too shocked or polite to intervene. She was counting on social pressure, my love for Jake, and the sunk costs of the wedding to force my submission. But Patricia had made one critical miscalculation. She assumed that my humble background would make me desperate to cling to security and acceptance, even at the cost of my dignity and independence. She didn't understand that growing up poor had taught me the opposite lesson. I knew exactly how dangerous it was to give someone else control over your financial survival. I stood slowly, my grandmother's vintage dress rustling in the absolute silence. Every eye in the room was fixed on me as I reached this crossroads that would define the rest of my life. I could submit to Patricia's demands and begin my marriage as a financial prisoner, or I could choose the harder path that honored my values and self-worth. You're right about one thing, Patricia, I said clearly, my voice carrying to every corner of the ballroom. This choice will define what kind of wife I become and what kind of marriage Jake and I will have. I looked directly at my husband, giving him one final opportunity to stand up for our partnership. Jake, if you can't defend me now at our wedding in front of everyone who loves us, Then you never will. This is your last chance to show me that our marriage will be a true partnership based on respect." He opened his mouth as if to speak, then closed it again, glancing between his mother and me with obvious anguish but no courage. That moment of hesitation told me everything I needed to know about what my future would hold as his wife. I lifted the hem of my grandmother's dress with both hands, maintaining as much dignity as possible while tears threatened to spill down my cheeks. I won't start my marriage by giving up my independence and self-respect. I deserve a partner who values what I bring to our relationship, not someone who sees my success as something to be controlled and taken away. The walk from our head table to the ballroom exit felt like the longest journey of my life. Guests stared in stunned silence as I moved past them, some with expressions of support and understanding, others appearing shocked by my decision to abandon my wedding over a financial disagreement. Behind me, I heard Jake call my name once weakly, but no footsteps followed. He had made his choice, and it wasn't me. My mother caught up with me in the lobby, wrapping her arms around me as the reality of what had just happened began to sink in. "Sweetheart, I am so proud of you," she whispered through her own tears. "You showed more courage in that room than most people show in a lifetime. You saved yourself from years of misery." But at that moment, standing in my wedding dress with my marriage over before it had truly begun, courage felt indistinguishable from devastating loss. 3 hours later, I sat in my apartment still wearing my grandmother's wedding dress, staring at my phone as it buzzed with calls and texts from confused guests trying to understand what had happened. The weight of the day's events pressed down on me like a physical force, making it difficult to breathe, let alone process the magnitude of what had transpired. I had mechanically changed out of my wedding shoes into slippers and removed the pins from my hair, but somehow changing out of the dress felt too final, too much like admitting that my dreams of marrying Jake were truly over. The vintage lace that had symbolized hope and new beginnings that morning now felt like a costume from someone else's life. When my phone rang with an unknown Arizona number, I almost ignored it entirely. The last thing I wanted was to speak with a reporter or wedding vendor trying to understand why the bride had walked out of her own reception. But something compelled me to answer, perhaps the hope that someone somewhere could help make sense of this nightmare. "Is this Misty?" asked a woman's voice, warm but hesitant. "My name is Margaret. I'm Patricia's sister, and I need to tell you something important about what happened today." The words Patricia's sister sent a chill down my spine. Was this some kind of follow-up attack, another family member calling to pressure me into returning and apologizing? I gripped the phone tighter, preparing to hang up if this conversation became another manipulation attempt. "I know you have no reason to trust me," Margaret continued quickly as if sensing my hesitation. "But I've been wrestling with my conscience for hours since my neighbor called to tell me what Patricia did at your wedding. I should have warned you months ago, but I was a coward. Now I can't stay silent anymore." Something in her voice, a quality of genuine distress and guilt, made me pause. "What do you mean you should have warned me?" Margaret's sigh was audible through the phone. "Because Patricia has done this before. 4 years ago, she pulled the exact same scheme with Danny Jake's older brother and his wife Sarah. I watched it destroy their marriage, and I did nothing to stop it. I can't let her ruin another young woman's life." My hands began shaking as the implications of her words sank in. Patricia's demand hadn't been a spontaneous moment of wedding day control issues. It was a calculated pattern, a practiced manipulation she had successfully executed before. "Tell me everything," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Margaret's story unfolded like a horror movie I was being forced to watch. Danny had met Sarah during his junior year of college, and they had dated for 5 years before getting married. Sarah was an elementary school teacher, earning $51,000 annually, while Danny worked as a mechanic, making slightly less. Their income difference wasn't as dramatic as Jake's and mine, but it was enough for Patricia to identify Sarah as the primary target for financial control. Patricia waited until right after their wedding, Margaret explained. Not during the ceremony like she did with you, but during their first family dinner as a married couple. She told Sarah that all wives in their family contributed their entire salaries to a collective household fund managed by the family matriarch, claiming it was a generations-old tradition. The manipulation was diabolically clever. By framing the demand as family tradition rather than personal control, Patricia made resistance seem like rejection of cultural heritage rather than self-defense against financial abuse. Sarah, who came from a family that prioritized harmony over conflict, had agreed to the arrangement rather than cause problems so early in her marriage. What happened to them? I asked, though I suspected the answer would be devastating. Sarah handed over her teaching salary for 2 years. Margaret continued, her voice heavy with regret. Patricia gave her a small allowance for personal expenses, maybe $300 a month, and made her justify every purchase. Sarah couldn't buy clothing without permission, couldn't go out with friends unless Patricia approved the expense, couldn't even contribute to baby shower gifts for her teaching colleagues without begging. The psychological torture of that arrangement was breathtaking. Sarah had essentially become a financial prisoner in her own marriage, working full-time, but having less spending autonomy than a teenager with a part-time job. Meanwhile, Patricia had used Sarah's income to fund her own lifestyle, purchasing expensive furniture, jewelry, and taking luxury vacations while claiming it was all for family benefit. But the money wasn't going to family expenses, was it? I asked, already knowing the answer. Not even close, Margaret confirmed. Patricia spent most of Sarah's salary on herself, while telling Danny that his wife's contribution was covering household costs. She bought a new car, remodeled her kitchen twice, and took solo trips to Europe while Sarah wore the same 3 dresses to school events because she couldn't afford new clothes. The scheme was brilliant in its cruelty. Patricia had isolated Sarah financially while simultaneously creating resentment between the spouses. Danny believed his wife's salary was supporting their shared expenses, so when Sarah expressed frustration about her lack of personal spending money, he thought she was being ungrateful for the financial security her job provided their family. Margaret described how Patricia had gradually escalated her control, monitoring Sarah's spending through shared bank accounts and requiring detailed justifications for every expenditure. When Sarah wanted to visit her parents in Oregon, she had to present a budget proposal to Patricia and explain why the trip was necessary. When her teaching colleagues invited her to a weekend workshop in Chicago, Patricia denied the request as frivolous spending on career advancement rather than family priorities. The psychological impact was devastating, Margaret said. Sarah became anxious and withdrawn, constantly worried about accidentally overspending or making Patricia angry. She stopped participating in social activities with other teachers because she couldn't afford to contribute equally to group gifts or dinner outings. Her personality completely changed under that kind of financial stress and isolation. The breaking point came when Sarah discovered that Patricia had been using her income to make down payments on rental properties that Patricia then put in her own name. Sarah's hard-earned teaching salary had been building Patricia's personal real estate portfolio, while Sarah herself couldn't afford to replace her worn-out winter coat. Sarah left Danny after 2.5 years of marriage, Margaret concluded. She couldn't take the financial abuse anymore, and Danny refused to stand up to his mother or acknowledge that anything was wrong with the arrangement. He'd been conditioned since childhood to believe that Patricia's control was normal family structure. I sat in stunned silence, absorbing the full horror of what Margaret had described. Patricia hadn't just demanded my salary on impulse or out of traditional beliefs about family finances. She had practiced this scheme before, perfected her manipulation techniques, and successfully destroyed at least one marriage while enriching herself. "Why didn't anyone stop her?" I finally asked. Margaret's voice broke slightly as she answered, "Because she's very good at making it seem reasonable to outsiders, and because she isolates her victims effectively. Danny still doesn't completely understand that what happened was abuse rather than normal family financial management. He thinks Sarah left him because she was selfish and career-focused, not because his mother was systematically destroying their marriage." The realization that Jake had grown up witnessing this pattern made his behavior at our wedding even more heartbreaking. He hadn't betrayed me out of malice or sudden greed, but because he had been conditioned from childhood to believe that Patricia's control was normal and that resisting her was disloyal and destructive. "There's more you need to know," Margaret said quietly. "Patricia has been planning to do this to you specifically for over a year. She researched your salary, calculated how much money she could access through your marriage to Jake, and has already made financial commitments based on counting on that income." My blood ran cold. "What kind of commitments?" "She put a deposit on a vacation home in Florida and has been telling her friends about the European cruise she's planning for next spring. She's been living beyond her means for months, expecting your salary to cover her debts and fund her lifestyle upgrades." The wedding day ambush suddenly made complete sense. Patricia hadn't just wanted control over my future earnings. She needed immediate access to my income to avoid financial consequences for spending money she didn't have. My refusal to submit to her demands hadn't just ruined her control scheme, it had potentially left her facing serious financial problems. "Misty," Margaret said urgently, "I have documentation of everything I've told you. Bank records, emails between Patricia and Danny, even photos of the rental properties she bought with Sarah's money. Would you be willing to meet with me tomorrow? I think you deserve to see the full scope of what you've escaped, and maybe we can find a way to prevent her from doing this to anyone else." For the first time since walking out of my wedding reception, I felt something other than devastation and loss. Margaret was offering me the missing pieces of a puzzle. I hadn't even known I was solving evidence that could help me understand not just what had happened, but why it was so important that I had found the courage to resist. "Yes," I said firmly. "I want to see everything. And I want to make sure Patricia never gets the chance to destroy another marriage the way she destroyed Sarah's and tried to destroy mine." The next morning, I met Margaret at a quiet coffee shop downtown, still feeling surreal in my casual jeans and sweater after 24 hours that had completely upended my life. She arrived carrying a thick manila folder and wearing the expression of someone who had wrestled with difficult decisions all night. "I brought everything," she said without preamble, sliding the folder across the small table. "Bank statements, email printouts, photographs, even some recordings I made of phone conversations when I started getting suspicious about what Patricia was doing to Sarah. I should have acted on this information years ago, but I was afraid of causing family drama." Opening the folder felt like unlocking a vault of evidence that revealed the true scope of Patricia's manipulation and fraud. The bank records showed clear patterns of financial abuse spanning multiple years, with Sarah's teaching salary being systematically diverted into accounts controlled entirely by Patricia. The most damning documents were email exchanges between Patricia and Danny during Sarah's marriage. Patricia had convinced Danny that managing his wife's salary was a normal family responsibility, using language that made her financial control sound protective rather than predatory. She wrote about helping young couples avoid the mistakes that lead to financial problems and teaching Sarah responsible money management through guided supervision. But the receipts and bank withdrawals told a completely different story. While Patricia was preaching financial responsibility to Sarah, she was spending lavishly on personal luxuries. Credit card statements showed purchases at high-end jewelry stores, expensive restaurants, and luxury hotels, all funded by Sarah's hard-earned teaching income. "Look at this," Margaret said, pointing to a particularly revealing email. Patricia wrote to Danny explaining that Sarah's salary needed to cover essential family investments, but then there are receipts for a $5,000 handbag and a $7,000 weekend spa retreat the same week Sarah was denied money to repair her car. The photographs were even more shocking. Patricia had taken pictures of her new possessions apparently to show off to friends, documenting expensive jewelry, furniture, and home improvements that had been purchased with money stolen from Sarah's paycheck. The images painted a clear picture of someone living far beyond their legitimate means through financial manipulation and theft. Margaret also shared audio recordings she had made during family phone calls when she began to suspect what was happening. In these conversations, Patricia bragged about her newfound financial flexibility and made disparaging comments about Sarah's attitude problems when Sarah had questioned certain expenses. She called Sarah ungrateful and selfish for wanting to keep some of her own salary, Margaret explained. Patricia actually convinced Danny that Sarah's resistance to total financial control was evidence of character flaws rather than normal self-preservation instincts. But the most devastating revelation came when Margaret showed me recent financial records indicating that Patricia was deeply in debt despite having access to Sarah's income for years. Credit card balances, unpaid loans, and mounting interest payments revealed someone who had been living recklessly beyond her means, even while controlling another person's entire salary. "She's facing potential bankruptcy," Margaret said quietly. "That's why she needed your income so desperately. She wasn't just planning to control your money for family purposes, she was counting on it to save her from financial ruin." I spread the documents across our coffee shop table, my software developer training, helping me analyze the patterns and connections in the financial data. Patricia had essentially been running a long-term embezzlement scheme disguised as family financial management, and she was now so deep in debt that she needed another victim to avoid serious consequences. The timeline became clear as I organized the evidence chronologically. Patricia had started spending beyond her means shortly after her husband's death, apparently believing she could maintain her lifestyle indefinitely. When her savings ran low, she had targeted Danny's wife as a source of replacement income. When that marriage collapsed and the money stopped flowing, she had set her sights on Jake's relationship with me. She researched my salary, I said, remembering Margaret's warning from the previous day. This wasn't just opportunistic greed, it was calculated targeting. Margaret nodded grimly. "I found internet search records on her computer when I helped her set up online banking last year. She had looked up salary information for software developers, researched your company's compensation structure, and even calculated potential tax implications of accessing your income through marriage." The premeditation was breathtaking. Patricia had been planning to financially exploit me for at least a year, carefully researching my earning potential and developing strategies to gain control over my career income. The sweet, supportive future mother-in-law persona had been completely fabricated to enable her theft scheme. Margaret pulled out another set of documents that made my stomach turn. These are text messages between Patricia and her sister Linda in Phoenix. I managed to get screenshots before Patricia learned I was collecting evidence. The text exchanges revealed Patricia's true thoughts about me and her financial plans. She referred to me as the perfect cash cow and bragged about how naive I was about her intentions. Most disturbing were messages discussing her strategy for the wedding day confrontation, including backup plans if I initially refused her demands. She wrote that you were too polite and invested in the relationship to cause a scene, and that social pressure would force you to comply even if you had private objections. Margaret read from her phone. She actually planned for you to resist, initially thinking it would make your eventual submission seem more voluntary. The manipulation had been even more sophisticated than I had realized. Patricia hadn't just been counting on my love for Jake or social pressure from wedding guests. She had psychologically profiled me, identified what she believed were my weaknesses, and crafted a manipulation strategy specifically designed to exploit my personality traits and relationship investment. But Patricia had made one critical miscalculation in her psychological assessment. She had confused politeness with weakness and underestimated the strength I had developed growing up in financial insecurity. My humble background hadn't made me desperate for acceptance at any cost. It had taught me to recognize and resist financial predators. Margaret showed me additional evidence that Patricia had already begun spending money she expected to receive from my salary. Credit card charges from the past 6 months included luxury items, travel bookings, and down payments on major purchases, all apparently funded by the assumption that she would soon have access to my $9,600 monthly income. She booked a 3-week European cruise for next spring. Margaret said, showing me the reservation confirmation. $8,000 charged to a credit card she can't afford to pay off without your money. She also put deposits down on a Florida vacation home and ordered custom furniture for a kitchen renovation. The financial house of cards Patricia had built was about to collapse, and my refusal to submit to her control at our wedding had accelerated the timeline. She wasn't just losing access to future income. She was facing immediate consequences for money she had already spent based on fraudulent expectations. Margaret leaned forward earnestly. "Misty, I think we need to take this information to the police. What Patricia did to Sarah was theft and financial abuse, even if they were too intimidated to report it at the time. Her attempted theft of your salary constitutes fraud, especially since she made financial commitments based on money she planned to steal." For the first time since walking out of my wedding reception, I felt a sense of purpose and direction. Patricia had counted on my silence and shame to protect her from consequences, just as she had relied on Sarah's fear and Danny's compliance to avoid accountability for her previous crimes. But I wasn't Sarah, and I wasn't going to disappear quietly while Patricia continued her pattern of destroying marriages and stealing from vulnerable women. I was going to use every resource available to expose her crimes and prevent her from finding new victims. "I want to contact Sarah," I said firmly. "And then I want to speak with a lawyer who specializes in financial fraud cases." Patricia made a serious mistake when she chose to target someone with the technical skills and professional network to investigate her properly. Margaret smiled with relief and determination. "Sarah has been hoping for years that someone would finally hold Patricia accountable. She'll be so grateful to know that her suffering might prevent other women from experiencing the same abuse." As we organized the evidence and planned our next steps, I realized that Patricia's wedding day ultimatum had inadvertently given me the most valuable gift possible. By forcing me to choose between my independence and my marriage, she had revealed her true nature before I was legally and financially trapped in her web of control. Walking out of that reception had been the beginning of my escape, not the end of my story. Over the next week, I transformed from heartbroken bride into strategic investigator, channeling my analytical software development skills toward documenting Patricia's pattern of financial abuse and building a comprehensive case against her. The pain of losing Jake and our planned future together was still raw, but it was gradually being replaced by determined anger at Patricia's systematic victimization of vulnerable women. Margaret had provided me with contact information for Sarah, who now lived in Portland, Oregon, where she had relocated after leaving Danny to rebuild her life and career. Our first phone conversation lasted 3 hours as Sarah shared details of her ordeal that went far beyond what Margaret had initially described. The financial control was just the beginning. Sarah explained, her voice still carrying traces of the trauma she had experienced. Patricia used my dependence on her for spending money to isolate me from friends and family. When my parents invited me to visit for Christmas, she would refuse to give me money for plane tickets unless I agreed to cut the visit short. When my teaching colleagues wanted to celebrate my birthday with dinner, Patricia would claim we couldn't afford the expense unless I worked extra tutoring hours to earn the privilege. The psychological manipulation had been comprehensive and devastating. Patricia had systematically destroyed Sarah's support network's professional relationships and sense of self-worth through financial coercion. By the time Sarah realized she was being abused, she had been so isolated and financially dependent that escape seemed impossible. She convinced Danny that I was being selfish and irresponsible with money, Sarah continued. When I tried to explain how degrading it was to ask permission for every small purchase, he would tell me that Patricia was just trying to help us build financial security. He genuinely believed that my resistance to her control was evidence that I didn't appreciate everything she was doing for our family. The most heartbreaking aspect of Sarah's story was how completely Danny had been manipulated into enabling his mother's abuse. Patricia had raised him to believe that maternal control was normal and beneficial, that questioning her decisions was disloyal, and that women who prioritized their careers or independence were fundamentally flawed. Danny never intended to hurt me, Sarah said sadly, but his complete inability to recognize abuse or stand up to his mother made our marriage impossible. Even now, 3 years after our divorce, he still doesn't fully understand that what Patricia did was criminal theft rather than family financial management. Sarah's willingness to document her experiences and provide testimony against Patricia was both brave and essential for building a strong case. She had kept detailed records of the financial abuse, including bank statements showing her salary deposits and Patricia's subsequent withdrawals, along with journal entries documenting the emotional impact of losing control over her own earnings. My next step was consulting with Amanda Rodriguez, an attorney who specialized in financial fraud and domestic abuse cases. Amanda's initial assessment of the evidence was both encouraging and sobering. Patricia's scheme clearly constitutes theft and financial abuse, Amanda explained during our consultation. The fact that she obtained money through deception and coercion combined with her pattern of targeting multiple victims elevates this beyond simple family financial disputes into criminal fraud territory. However, Amanda also warned that prosecuting financial abuse within families presented unique challenges, particularly when victims were married to willing participants in the scheme. Danny's cooperation with Patricia's control over Sarah's salary complicated the legal landscape, even though he had been manipulated into enabling the abuse. The strongest case we can build focuses on Patricia's attempted theft of your salary, Amanda continued. She made explicit demands for money that didn't belong to her, used threats and coercion to attempt compliance, and made financial commitments based on money she planned to steal. That's textbook fraud with clear criminal intent. But Amanda suggested that our most effective strategy might not be criminal prosecution alone, but a combination of legal action and public exposure that would prevent Patricia from finding new victims while holding her accountable for past crimes. Financial predators like Patricia rely on shame and isolation to protect themselves from consequences, Amanda explained. If we can expose her pattern publicly and force her to face legal and financial consequences, we send a message to potential future victims while ensuring she can't easily target other vulnerable women. The plan we developed was comprehensive and multi-pronged. Amanda would file complaints with both law enforcement and consumer protection agencies documenting Patricia's pattern of financial fraud and seeking criminal charges where possible. Meanwhile, I would work with Margaret and Sarah to expose Patricia's crimes to her extended family and social circle, ensuring that potential future victims would be warned about her tactics. My technical skills proved invaluable for organizing and analyzing the evidence. I created detailed financial timelines showing how Patricia had spent money stolen from Sarah, cross-referenced with her current debt obligations and the income she had expected to steal from me. The data painted a clear picture of someone who had been systematically defrauding family members to fund an unsustainable lifestyle. But the most important element of our plan was a face-to-face confrontation with Patricia and Jake, designed to force accountability and ensure they understood the full scope of consequences they would face. Margaret arranged a family dinner under the pretense that I wanted to apologize and discuss compromise gambling, that Patricia's greed would overcome any suspicion about my true intentions. "She's eager to meet with you," Margaret reported after speaking with Patricia. "She thinks your week of silence means you've realized you made a mistake walking out of your wedding and that you're ready to submit to her financial control in exchange for getting Jake back." Patricia's continued arrogance and sense of entitlement, even after I had publicly rejected her demands, revealed someone who had never faced serious consequences for her manipulative behavior. She genuinely believed that social pressure time to reconsider and my emotional attachment to Jake would eventually force my compliance. Jake had been calling and texting constantly throughout the week, leaving voicemails that alternated between apologies for the wedding incident and attempts to convince me that his mother's financial management plan wasn't as unreasonable as it had seemed. His messages revealed someone who was genuinely confused about why I couldn't simply accept Patricia's control as a minor inconvenience in our otherwise happy relationship. "I know Mom came on a little strong at the wedding," he said in one particularly tone-deaf voicemail, "but she's just trying to help us build financial security. Can't we find some kind of compromise that makes everyone comfortable? I love you, Misty, and I don't understand why money has to be more important than our relationship." Jake's complete inability to recognize the abusive nature of his mother's demands, combined with his characterization of my resistance as prioritizing money over love, confirmed that Margaret's plan to expose Patricia in front of the entire family was necessary. Jake needed to understand not just what his mother had done to me, but what she had done to Sarah, and what she planned to do to any future daughters-in-law. The Sunday dinner was scheduled for the following weekend at Patricia's house, with the entire extended family invited to witness what Patricia expected would be my public apology and submission. She had no idea that instead of gaining control over my salary, she was about to face the most comprehensive exposure of her crimes that anyone had ever assembled. As I prepared for the confrontation, organizing evidence packets for each family member and rehearsing my presentation with Amanda's guidance, I felt a strange sense of peace settling over me. Patricia had destroyed my marriage and stolen my wedding day, but she had inadvertently freed me from a relationship that would have gradually eroded my independence and self-worth. Now it was time to ensure that her pattern of abuse ended permanently, and that no other woman would face the choice between financial freedom and family acceptance that had devastated my life and destroyed Sarah's marriage. Sunday evening arrived with an unseasonably warm October breeze that carried the scent of burning leaves through Patricia's suburban neighborhood. As I pulled into her driveway, my hands steady on the steering wheel despite the magnitude of what I was about to do, I could see through the dining room windows that the entire extended family had gathered as Margaret had promised. Inside, Patricia had set her best china and crystal, clearly intending this dinner to be a celebration of my capitulation rather than an exposure of her crimes. She greeted me at the door with a triumphant smile that barely concealed her satisfaction at what she believed was my inevitable surrender. "Misty, darling, I'm so glad you've come to your senses," she said, embracing me with false warmth. "Family is the most important thing in life, and I knew you would eventually understand that Jake's happiness has to come first." Jake approached hesitantly, his face a mixture of hope and uncertainty. He had clearly spent the week convincing himself that our marriage could still be salvaged if I would just accept his mother's financial management as a reasonable compromise. The relief in his eyes suggested he had never seriously considered the possibility that I might reject their ultimatum permanently. "I've missed you so much," he said quietly, reaching for my hand. "I'm glad we can finally work through this together and move forward with our lives." Around the dining table sat 12 family members, including Danny, several cousins, aunts, and uncles, and Margaret, who caught my eye with an almost imperceptible nod of encouragement. The atmosphere was festive, with Patricia clearly having told everyone that this gathering would celebrate the resolution of our wedding day misunderstanding. Patricia had prepared Jake's favorite meal pot roast with herb potatoes and kept the conversation light throughout dinner, avoiding any mention of financial arrangements or wedding incidents. She was clearly saving the main event for dessert, when she expected me to formally apologize and agree to hand over control of my salary. As Patricia served her famous apple pie and began pouring coffee, she tapped her spoon against her crystal water glass in the same gesture she had used to command attention at our wedding reception. The sound sent a chill through me, but this time I was prepared for what would follow. "Everyone, I asked you here tonight to witness a very important moment in our family's history." Patricia began, her voice warm with anticipated victory. "Misty has had some time to think about our conversation last weekend, and she wants to share something with all of you." She gestured toward me expectantly, clearly believing I was about to deliver the public apology and submission she had orchestrated. Jake squeezed my hand encouragingly, still completely unaware of what was actually about to unfold. I stood slowly, reaching for the briefcase I had placed beside my chair, and smiled at the faces around the table. "You're absolutely right, Patricia. I do have something very important to share with everyone here tonight, but it's not what you're expecting." I began distributing the evidence packets Margaret and I had prepared, placing thick manila folders in front of each family member, while Patricia's confident expression gradually shifted to confusion and growing alarm. "What you're about to see is documentation of a pattern of financial fraud and abuse that has been going on in this family for years," I said clearly, my voice carrying to every corner of the suddenly silent dining room. Patricia didn't just make an unreasonable demand at our wedding. She attempted to steal my salary as part of a calculated scheme she has used to destroy at least one marriage and defraud thousands of dollars from family members. Patricia's face went white as family members began opening their folders and examining bank statements, email printouts, and photographs. "This is ridiculous," she sputtered. "Misty is obviously bitter about our disagreement and is making up lies to cause family drama." But the documentation spoke for itself. Danny's face crumpled as he recognized bank records from his marriage to Sarah, finally seeing clear evidence of how his mother had systematically stolen his wife's salary while convincing him that Sarah was the problem in their relationship. "Danny, look at page 12, I said gently. Those are receipts for the jewelry and vacation your mother purchased with Sarah's teaching salary during the same month Sarah was denied money to visit her dying grandmother in Oregon. The silence that followed was deafening as the full scope of Patricia's deception became clear to everyone present. Aunt Linda gasped audibly as she examined photographs of expensive purchases that Patricia had claimed were necessary family investments funded by everyone's shared contributions. Margaret stood to support my presentation, her voice steady despite years of guilt about remaining silent. I have recordings of phone conversations where Patricia bragged about her financial control over Sarah and discussed her plans to do the same thing to Misty. She referred to Misty as the perfect cash cow and calculated how much money she could steal before anyone realized what was happening. Jake stared at the evidence in front of him, his face cycling through expressions of confusion, denial, and dawning horror as he began to understand the true nature of his mother's behavior. "This can't be right," he said weakly. "Mom was just trying to help Sarah learn financial responsibility. Jake, your mother stole over $60,000 from Sarah during their marriage," I said, showing him the financial analysis I had prepared. "Sarah worked full-time as a teacher, but had less spending money than a part-time babysitter because your mother was using her salary to fund luxury purchases and European vacations." The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. Credit card statements showed Patricia living far beyond her legitimate means. Bank records documented systematic theft of Sarah's income, and email exchanges revealed calculated manipulation designed to maintain control while avoiding accountability. Cousin Rebecca, who had always looked up to Patricia as a successful family matriarch, stared at photographs of expensive jewelry that Patricia had claimed were gifts from her late husband. "These receipts show you bought all of this with Sarah's money," she said, her voice filled with disgust. "You've been lying to all of us for years." Patricia's attempts at damage control became increasingly desperate as she realized that her carefully constructed facade was crumbling in front of her entire family. "You're all being manipulated by a bitter, selfish woman who can't accept normal family financial management," she declared. "Successful women like Misty think they're too good to contribute to family welfare." But her words rang hollow against the mountain of documented evidence. Margaret presented the most damaging revelation last, sharing recent financial records that showed Patricia's current debt crisis and her planned spending based on anticipated access to my salary. She booked an $8,000 cruise and put deposits on a Florida vacation home before Misty's wedding even took place, Margaret announced. She's been spending money she planned to steal, and now she's facing bankruptcy because her latest victim had the courage to walk away. The room erupted as family members began expressing their outrage and disbelief. Danny broke down completely, finally understanding how thoroughly his mother had manipulated him and destroyed his marriage. "Sarah tried to tell me," he whispered through tears. "She tried to explain that something was wrong, and I told her she was being ungrateful. I destroyed my own marriage defending Mom's theft." Jake sat in stunned silence, staring at evidence that his mother had not only attempted to steal from me, but had successfully defrauded his brother's wife for years, while convincing Jake that Patricia's behavior was normal and protective. The foundation of everything he believed about family loyalty and his mother's character had been shattered in a single evening. Patricia's final attempt at control was a furious outburst that revealed her true nature more clearly than any evidence could. "You ungrateful, selfish bitch," she screamed at me across the dinner table. "After everything I've done for this family, you have the nerve to attack me with lies and manipulation. Jake deserves a wife who understands loyalty and sacrifice, not some career-obsessed bitch who thinks money is more important than family." The ugly truth behind Patricia's sweet maternal facade was finally exposed. Around the table, family members recoiled from the venomous hatred in her voice, understanding for the first time the psychological abuse that had been disguised as loving concern. Uncle Robert, Patricia's older brother, stood up slowly and looked directly at his sister with an expression of profound disappointment. "Patricia, you need to leave this house right now. We'll be discussing as a family how to handle this situation, but your presence is no longer welcome at family gatherings until you make full restitution for what you've stolen." One by one, family members began expressing their support for holding Patricia accountable and their regret for not recognizing the signs of her abusive behavior sooner. The woman who had expected to celebrate her victory over me instead found herself completely isolated and facing unified family condemnation. As Patricia gathered her purse and coat, her final words to me were a threat disguised as a prediction. "You'll regret destroying this family," she hissed. "Jake will never forgive you for turning everyone against his mother, and you'll spend the rest of your life alone because no decent man will want a woman who puts career before family." But her threats carried no weight anymore. The truth had been revealed, justice was finally being served, and Patricia's pattern of abuse was ending permanently. The week following our family dinner confrontation brought swift and comprehensive consequences for Patricia's years of financial fraud and manipulation. Amanda Rodriguez worked efficiently with law enforcement to file formal charges armed with the mountain of evidence we had compiled and witness testimony from both Sarah and multiple family members who had finally understood the scope of Patricia's crimes. Patricia was arrested on charges of theft, fraud, and financial abuse. The local prosecutor, familiar with similar cases of family financial manipulation, was particularly interested in pursuing charges because of Patricia's pattern of targeting multiple victims and her systematic approach to stealing money through deception and coercion. The immediate financial consequences were severe and appropriate. Patricia was forced to liquidate her luxury possessions to begin making restitution to Sarah for the money stolen during her marriage to Danny. The expensive jewelry designer handbags and home improvements purchased with Sarah's teaching salary were sold to recover as much money as possible. Patricia also had to cancel her planned European cruise and forfeit the deposits on her Florida vacation home, leaving her facing bankruptcy as the full extent of her debt crisis became public knowledge. The credit cards she had maxed out expecting to pay them with my stolen salary now represented insurmountable financial obligations. Most satisfying was watching Patricia's social reputation crumble as word spread through her suburban Cincinnati community about her arrest and the nature of her crimes. The woman who had presented herself as a pillar of family values and traditional marriage was exposed as someone who systematically destroyed marriages through financial abuse and theft. Jake's response to the revelations was more complex and painful to witness. The complete collapse of his understanding about his mother's character and his own role in enabling her abuse sent him into a spiral of guilt and self-examination that ultimately led to him seeking professional therapy to address years of psychological manipulation. "I realize now that I've never had a healthy relationship with boundaries or conflict," he told me during one of our final conversations. "Mom trained me from childhood to believe that questioning her was disloyal and that family harmony was more important than individual rights. I failed you completely because I never learned to recognize abuse or stand up for what was right." While Jake's recognition of his failures was genuine and his commitment to therapy was sincere, the damage to our relationship was irreparable. I could forgive his confusion and manipulation by Patricia, but I couldn't forget his willingness to sacrifice my financial independence and dignity to avoid conflict with his mother. Trust once broken so completely couldn't be rebuilt on apologies alone. Danny's healing process was even more devastating to witness. Learning the truth about Patricia's theft from Sarah and his own role in enabling that abuse destroyed his sense of identity as a good husband and family member. He reached out to Sarah repeatedly, desperate to apologize and somehow make amends for the years of financial and emotional abuse she had suffered. Sarah, now thriving in her Portland teaching position and engaged to a supportive partner who valued her independence, was gracious but clear about boundaries. "I'm glad Danny finally understands what happened," she told me during one of our phone conversations. "But I can't rebuild a relationship with someone who was so completely unable to protect me from his mother's abuse. Some damage can't be undone even with the best intentions." The broader family response was overwhelmingly supportive and restorative. Uncle Robert took leadership in organizing family meetings to address the financial restitution and ensure that Patricia could never again manipulate family relationships for financial gain. Several cousins reached out to apologize for not recognizing the warning signs of Patricia's behavior and for not supporting Sarah during her ordeal. Margaret's courage in finally speaking up and providing evidence was particularly celebrated by the family. Her decision to overcome years of guilt and fear in order to protect me from Patricia's scheme had prevented another marriage from being destroyed and finally brought justice for Sarah's suffering. For my own healing and future, I threw myself back into my career with renewed energy and purpose. My experience with Patricia's attempted financial control had given me a deeper understanding of how economic abuse operates and how important financial independence is for women's safety and autonomy. Within 6 months, I received a promotion to lead software architect with a salary increase to $11,000 monthly. My manager praised my analytical skills and leadership qualities, noting that my ability to handle complex, high-pressure situations with grace and determination made me an invaluable asset to our development team. I also began volunteering with a local domestic violence organization, helping other women recognize the warning signs of financial abuse and develop strategies for protecting their economic independence. My experience with Patricia's manipulation provided valuable insights into how financial predators operate and how family pressure can be used to enable abuse. The legal case against Patricia concluded with her pleading guilty to fraud charges and being sentenced to 18 months in prison, along with 5 years of probation and mandatory restitution payments to Sarah. The judge's comments during sentencing reflected the seriousness of financial abuse within families and the importance of holding perpetrators accountable. "Financial abuse is a serious crime that destroys lives and relationships," Judge Martinez stated. The defendant's systematic manipulation of family members and theft of their earnings represents a particularly cruel form of betrayal that cannot be dismissed as simple family financial disagreements. 1 year after my wedding day disaster, I found myself in a completely different place emotionally and professionally. The pain of losing Jake and the life we had planned together had evolved into gratitude for escaping a situation that would have gradually eroded my independence and self-worth. I had also begun dating again with a much clearer understanding of what healthy relationships looked like and what warning signs to watch for in potential partners. My experience with Patricia's manipulation had taught me to value partners who celebrated my success, rather than seeing it as something to be controlled or diminished. My current relationship with David, a fellow software developer who worked at a nonprofit focused on financial literacy, was built on mutual respect and shared values around independence and equality. When I told him about Patricia's attempted theft of my salary, his immediate response was outrage on my behalf, rather than suggestions for compromise or family harmony. "I can't imagine trying to control my partner's career or finances," he said. "Your success makes me proud, not threatened. Any family that would demand you give up your independence doesn't deserve to have you as a member." The contrast between David's supportive response and Jake's willingness to sacrifice my autonomy for his mother's approval highlighted how dramatically my standards and expectations had evolved through this experience. Sarah and I maintained our friendship, bonding over our shared experience of escaping Patricia's financial abuse and supporting each other's healing processes. We occasionally spoke at workshops about recognizing financial manipulation in relationships, helping other women understand that economic control is a serious form of abuse, regardless of how it's justified by family tradition or gender roles. Most importantly, I had learned to trust my instincts about relationships and never again compromise my core values for social pressure or family approval. The courage I had found to walk out of my own wedding reception had been the beginning of a journey towards stronger boundaries, clearer self-advocacy, and deeper self-respect. As I reflected on everything that had happened since that devastating October day, I realized that Patricia had inadvertently given me the greatest gift possible. By forcing me to choose between my independence and my marriage, she had revealed her true nature before I was legally and financially trapped in her web of control. Walking away from that wedding reception had been the most difficult decision of my life, but it had also been the most important step toward building the authentic, respectful relationship I deserved. The life lesson that emerged from this painful experience was profound and lasting. True love and healthy relationships require mutual respect, support for each other's goals and independence, and the courage to stand up against manipulation and abuse even when it comes from family members. Financial independence isn't selfish or unloving, it's essential for safety, dignity, and the ability to make choices based on values rather than economic desperation. Sometimes the greatest act of love for yourself is refusing to accept anything less than you deserve, even when that choice comes with significant immediate costs. The temporary pain of walking away from a compromised relationship is far preferable to the long-term damage of accepting abuse for the sake of keeping peace. I learned that healthy families celebrate each member's success and independence rather than demanding sacrifice for someone else's benefit. Real love doesn't require you to diminish yourself to make others comfortable, and anyone who demands such sacrifice doesn't truly have your best interests at heart. Today, as I sit in my own apartment that I can afford with my own salary, surrounded by career achievements and genuine friendships built on mutual respect, I know that choosing my independence over Patricia's control was the right decision. The wedding I lost was far less valuable than the self-respect and autonomy I gained. Thank you for listening to my story. I hope it encourages other women to recognize financial manipulation early and gives you courage to prioritize your own well-being, even when family pressure makes resistance difficult. I'd love to hear your thoughts about this situation. Have you ever faced pressure from family members to make sacrifices that would compromise your independence or career? How do you think couples should handle income differences and financial decisions in marriage? Please share your experiences in the comments below. If this story resonated with you or might help someone else recognize similar manipulation patterns, please like this video and share it with others who might benefit from hearing about financial abuse warning signs. Subscribe to stay updated on more stories about standing up for yourself and building healthy relationships based on mutual respect. Remember, you deserve partnerships that celebrate your success and support your independence, not relationships that demand you diminish yourself for someone else's comfort. Stay strong, trust your instincts, and never be afraid to walk away from situations that require you to sacrifice your core values and self-worth.